In its scale, fanaticism, and sheer criminality, Nazi Germany's war against the Soviet Union has few rivals in the history of armed conflict. When Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, it came as a big surprise to both Stalin and the Allied powers. After all, they had been in good terms until recently, and even signed a pact of non-aggression in 1939. Nonetheless, Germany ordered their troops to invade the neighboring nation and to charge against Moscow in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. The Eastern Front became, in the next years, the cruelest battleground of World War II. Nazis had a special hatred against Polish and Soviet soldiers, but they were met with a similar degree of violence when Soviets managed to capture Nazis. Not only they were brutally tortured and executed during the war, but the captivity of German prisoners of war continued years after the end of hostilities. Was this justice or pure hatred? How brutal were battles in the Eastern Front? Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs. What happened to the captured Germans in the Eastern Front? Nothing could have prepared Hitler for what he found in the Eastern Front. The harsh winter, Soviet discipline, and the fierce partisan activity made any advancement toward Moscow an ordeal. Nazi soldiers died in the thousands due to starvation, cold weather, and the many skirmishes and traps laid by Soviet partisans. But even these deaths became preferable to what the Soviets did with captured Germans. These Soviet men and women were looking for an opportunity to get back at the Germans. Throughout Operation Barbarossa and the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler had ordered his soldiers to liquidate all so-called Bolsheviks and anyone who could be considered their allies or accomplices. For the Wehrmacht, the order was clear. All Slavic peoples had to be eliminated. The war waged by Germany against the Soviet Union was a war of extermination, quite contrary to how they acted on the Western Front and the treatment of the French. Moreover, the Germans were ordered by Hitler to scorch earth on their retreat. With these orders, the Nazi soldiers massacred entire villages and destroyed towns. They left only death and destruction in their wake. But when the Red Army started to retaliate, all the German actions quickly came back to haunt them. These terrible genocidal actions on the part of Hitler's soldiers stuck in the collective imagination of Soviet soldiers. In fact, it did not take much propaganda on the part of Stalin to demonize the Germans. Many of these Russians who fought against the Nazis were themselves victims. Their homes destroyed, their mothers, brothers, and sisters massacred. The Soviet people undoubtedly bore the brunt of the war. There were more than 27 million people killed. With all this accumulated resentment and hatred for the Germans, Soviet youth answered Stalin's call to arms to push the Germans back in what can only be described as a truly destructive passion. Stalin, too, ordered the Red Army to initiate a scorched earth policy to deny the Germans and their allies basic supplies as they advanced eastward. To carry out that order, destruction battalions were formed in frontline areas, having the authority to summarily execute any suspicious person. The destruction battalions burned down villages, schools, and public buildings. As a part of this policy, the Red Army and the Soviet secret police massacred thousands of anti-Soviet prisoners. The secret police was in charge of the prisoners of war. They were responsible for bringing them from the front line, where they were captured, to the prisoner of war camps in inland Russia. But as most transports were used for the war effort, Stalin's secret police decided to save resources by making the prisoners march through the cold Russian steppes. In Ukraine and western Belarusia, 60,000 people were forced to evacuate on foot. The official Soviet count had more than 9,800 reportedly executed in prisons, 1,443 executed in the process of evacuation, 59 killed for attempting to escape, 23 killed by German bombs, and 1,057 deaths from other causes. Not all of these prisoners were German. Many were political prisoners that had been captured before the war even began. In total, the Soviet Union killed almost 1 million captured Nazis. Out of the 90,000 captured in the Battle of Stalingrad, the bloodiest of the whole campaign, only 5,000 Germans were lucky enough to be sent back to their country alive. The key to understanding this bloodbath lies in the fact that Soviet authorities did not punish, and sometimes actually encouraged, brutality against the German prisoners. They were not committing war crimes nor violating international treaties, but barely doing a service to the motherland by erasing the fascist pigs from the land. With the advancement of the war, The political administration of the Red Army tried to limit the practice of killing prisoners, as they could be valuable sources of intelligence that could be used against the enemy, but their efforts were fruitless. In battle, Red Army men and commanders did not bother capturing soldiers and officers. There are known cases of captives that were strangled and stabbed to death with knives of bayonets. Seeing that they could not stop their soldiers from murdering captured Germans, the Red Army chose to take an administrative approach, asking officers to at least make an inventory of the weapons and personal belongings taken from the dead Nazis. Leningrad, an example of Nazi cruelty. The Germans attacked Leningrad in August 1941. In the following 3 black months of 1941, 400,000 residents of the city worked to build the city's fortifications as fighting continued, while 160,000 others joined the ranks of the Red Army. Worker battalions and even schoolboy units were formed all over the city, who joined in digging trenches as they prepared to defend the city. On the 7th of September, the German 20th Motorized Division seized the town of Schlisselburg, cutting off all land routes to Leningrad. The Germans severed the railroads to Moscow and captured the railroad to Murmansk with Finnish assistance to inaugurate the start of a siege that would last for over 2 years. The siege became one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history, and it was possibly the costliest siege in history due to the number of casualties which were suffered throughout its duration. An estimated 1.5 million people died as a result of the siege, in what effectively was a genocide perpetrated by the German army. When Hitler was sure that no roads to and from the city of Leningrad remained open, he ordered the final destruction of Leningrad with no prisoners taken, and on 9th September, Army Group North began the final push. Within 10 days, it had advanced within 11 kilometers or 7 miles of the city. However, the push over the last kilometers was very slow, and casualties mounted. Hitler, now out of patience, ordered that Leningrad should not be stormed, but rather starved into submission. Army Group Center remained static and was subjected to numerous Soviet counterattacks, in particular the Yelnya offensive, in which the Germans suffered their first major tactical defeat since their invasion began. This Red Army victory also provided an important boost to Soviet morale. These attacks prompted Hitler to concentrate his attention back to Army Group Center and its drive on Moscow. The Germans ordered the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies to break off their siege of Leningrad and support Army Group Center in its attack on Moscow. Soviet troops, many of whom had friends and family in Leningrad, were not willing to let the Germans get their way. There are countless stories of bravery in fighting the Nazis during this time of the war. One of these heroes of the Soviet Union was Emir Lumanov, a Crimean senior lieutenant in the Red Army. Since he spoke German, he was sent on a mission on the 20th of July in 1941, where he dressed up in a Nazi military uniform, pretending to be a Nazi commanding officer checking on a unit. All the members of the unit lay their weapons aside in order to present their identifying papers to Lumanov, only for him to then take the entire company as prisoners of war. As his mission consisted in hindering the advance of the German army, and there were no high-ranking officers that could provide him with valuable information, he chose to have a squad of Soviet soldiers execute the prisoners by shooting them against a brick wall. Soon after, the Germans lay siege to Leningrad, and Lumanov was appointed as leader of a battalion that took part in the Yelnya offensive. The battles for Yelnya in August 1941 were extremely intense. On the 11th of August, he received orders to lead his battalion in advancing further into Yelnya to expel Nazi forces from the western slopes in the area. In just one day of battle, his battalion killed 200 Nazis. After receiving orders to advance further east, they went on to capture 2 tanks and 4 anti-tank guns from the Nazis. By 31st August, his battalion was running very low on ammunition and ran out of food, yet he continued to lead them in battle, at which point they were fighting off numerically superior forces. In 4 days, they managed to break out of the encirclement, but Lumanov died in the heat of battle on 5th September 1941. He had taken several German lives in the process, the ruthless killings of Germans by Soviet women. During the campaign, the Germans were profoundly surprised to learn that the Red Army had recruited so many women to fight alongside men. Indeed, this was an anomaly in any army of the time, and even today. For some German soldiers and officers, to know that they were fighting against women was a disgusting thought, but for others, it enticed their most basic fantasies. It is calculated that more than 800,000 Soviet women served in the Red Army during World War II. Female soldiers who were directly involved in combat achieved particular international renown. The night bomber pilots known as Night Witches and the female snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko and Rosa Shanina are the most extraordinary examples of female participation in the war. Between 1941 and 1945, a total of 2,484 Soviet female snipers were deployed for the war, and their combined tally of kills is estimated to be at least 11,280. At first, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, thousands of women presented themselves in Red Army offices to volunteer, but most of them were turned away as they had no experience in the battlefield. However, after massive losses in the face of Operation Barbarossa, attitudes had to be changed, ensuring a greater role for women who wanted to fight. The High Command of the Red Army allowed for women to be drafted, and they were incorporated in great numbers to medical and auxiliary units, but also to fighting battalions. However, more than half of these women worked in the medical service of the Soviet armed forces. They accounted for 41% of the frontline doctors and 100% of the nursing staff. Those near the front performed their duties under especially difficult conditions and in constant mortal danger. Military medical personnel were second only to the infantry in terms of the number of combat losses. For this reason, thousands of women were awarded the status of Hero of the Soviet Union, being praised and loved in their communities once the war was over. But for others, it was a completely different story. Around 6 million Soviet women died in the course of the war, around 2.5 million of which were involved in the partisan war against the occupying Nazis. Most of the time, the Nazis did not get to see the faces of their female executioners. Women in the Red Army excelled in sniper marksmanship. This not only meant having excellent aim, but also remaining undetected for long periods of time. Over 2,000 women were trained as sharpshooters and deployed to some of the most dangerous battlegrounds, far from their companies, and required to lie still for hours to avoid detection and await the perfect shot. Former kindergarten teacher Tanya Baramzina notched 16 kills on the Belarusian front before parachuting behind enemy lines, where she killed another 20 before. When she was cornered in a dugout while tending to some wounded comrades, she defended the position for as long as she could, despite being heavily outnumbered. When the first 3 German soldiers ran up to the dugout, she opened fire with a machine gun, killing them. When more attackers approached, she opened additional fire, determined to fight until her last breath or until she ran out of ammunition. This was exactly what happened, and the brave soldier finally found herself with no more weapons to use. After running out of grenades to throw at her attackers, she was left defenseless as 2 German soldiers entered the dugout from behind and threw their grenades down, injuring her before entering. The Germans dragged her out by her hair before brutally torturing her. With endless cruelty, the soldiers stabbed Baramzina and mutilated her with bayonets, while she loudly swore that they would pay for their crimes. She was brutally beaten with the butts of German rifles until she was barely alive. It was at this moment that one of the Germans had the idea of shooting her in the head with an anti-tank rifle intended to pierce several inches of steel. She was killed at point blank, and her head and body were practically unrecognizable when the rest of her battalion found her the next morning. Endless bravery of the anti-Nazi women partisans. As soon as the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, the people in most cities and towns organized themselves to fight the invaders. Women contributed in large numbers to the Soviet partisan movement, mainly because they saw it as an opportunity to finally fight for their country, after the recruitment offices of the Red Army usually turned them down. In fact, many women were among the most famous and heroic partisans, especially very young ones. In October 1941, an 18-year-old high school student from Moscow named Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya volunteered for a partisan unit. Together with other partisans, Kosmodemyanskaya marched southwest toward Naro-Fominsk, crossing the front line into territory occupied by the Germans. They mined roads and cut communication lines. On November 27, 1941, Kosmodemyanskaya received an assignment to burn the village of Petrishchevo, where a German cavalry regiment was stationed. Together with fellow partisans Boris Krenov and Vasily Klubkov, she set fire to 3 houses in the village, but this was not enough. and she was caught alone trying to burn a fourth house. After being arrested, Kosmodemyanskaya was stripped, beaten, interrogated, and savagely tortured with 200 lashes. Her body was also burnt in several places, but she refused to give any information. The following morning, she was marched to the center of the village with a board around her neck bearing the inscription "House Burner." At the central square, she was hanged and left for everyone to see. Kosmodemyanskaya was the first woman to become hero of the Soviet Union during the war in February 16, 1942. Young as she might have been, Kosmodemyanskaya was not the youngest woman to become a hero of the Soviet Union. This honor belongs to another brave resistance fighter, Zinaida Portnova. In 1942, at the age of 16, Portnova joined the Belarusian resistance movement, becoming a member of the local underground organization named Young Avengers. She began by distributing Soviet propaganda leaflets in German-occupied Belarus, collecting and hiding weapons for Soviet soldiers, and reporting on German troop movements. After learning how to use weapons and explosives from the older members of the group, Portnova participated in sabotage actions at a gas pump, a local power plant, and a brick factory. It was later estimated that these acts may have killed upwards of 100 German soldiers. In 1943, Portnova became employed as a kitchen-aide in Obol. In August, she poisoned the food meant for the Nazi garrison stationed there. Immediately falling suspect, she said she was innocent and ate some of the food in front of the Nazis to prove it was not poisoned. After she did not fall ill immediately, they released her. Portnova became sick afterwards, vomiting heavily, but eventually recovering from the poison after drinking a large quantity of whey. After she did not return to work, the Germans realized she had been the culprit and started searching for her. It was not until January 1944 that she was finally caught. She was interrogated by a Gestapo officer in the village of Goriani. The officer, convinced that she was only a harmless girl, left his guard down. Portnova took the investigator's pistol off the table, then shot and killed him. When 2 German soldiers entered after hearing the gunshots, she shot them as well. She then attempted to escape the compound and ran into the woods, where she was caught near the banks of a river. After being recaptured, Portnova was tortured. She was later driven into the forest and executed. She was not 18 at the time. In 1958, Portnova was posthumously made a hero of the Soviet Union. There is a monument to her in the city of Minsk, and some youth pioneer movement detachments were named after her. What happened to German women in Allied hands? Although the Germans did not have women in combat, 140,000 were attached to the armed forces when war broke out in 1939. These consisted of 50,000 secretarial staff and a further 90,000 auxiliaries. By 1944, the numbers had grown to 300,000. Operating under military law, their roles were constantly expanding, and they could be found not only inside Germany but also in the general government, Belarus, the Baltic states, occupied France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. This included the 8,000 women working in communications and 12,500 attached to the army in the field. In addition, there were approximately 130,000 women in the Luftwaffe, again largely in secretarial and ancillary roles, but who were increasingly used to operate anti-aircraft batteries. In principle, then, it would have been unusual to find German women in the front lines, let alone to take German women as prisoners. However, as the regime became ever more desperate, women were issued with handguns to defend themselves. And in the last days of the war, Hitler completely contradicted his earlier policies on the militarization of women by sanctioning an armed women's battalion, which it was hoped would have a salutary effect on the men. There was also a substantial number of female German Red Cross personnel attached to the armed forces who were entitled to protection under the Geneva Convention. In general, German policy had been to avoid allowing any women in the armed forces to fall into enemy hands, and local commanders were made personally responsible for their safety in the face of imminent danger. From 30 September 1944, all women under the age of 21 were ordered to be removed from occupied territories after some women units had been captured in Romania by the Russians. This policy of staged withdrawal inevitably conflicted with the increasing need to use their skills and add to their workloads so that more men could be freed for frontline service. The women who fell into Allied hands were rounded up in much the same way as their male counterparts as the war came to an end. More than 100 seem to have been held at the Pilsener North Barracks, where they became known as the Pilsener Sparrows after they had formed a choir to sing for their captors. First controlled by the Americans, Pilsen was later handed over to the Russians, and there was some urgency in finding a solution to the problem of the female prisoners. Most of them were surprisingly freed, but after screening, one female communications assistant was retained because she had been identified as member of the SS. Most of the women, however, were unwilling to go back to their homes in the Soviet zone of occupation for fear of what might befall them on their return. There is no indication when these women were finally released and repatriated, except that it is assumed that all had left the camps by the end of 1948. In the internment Soviet camps for prisoners of war, head shavings were commonplace and others were imprisoned, but there is an estimate that 200 women were martyred in the last days of the war. Although there are no official Soviet records, it is believed that these women were tortured to death in order to make them confess to participating in German war crimes. But the freed women also had a grim future. The rapid release of some of these women meant that they were caught up in the widespread and often lethal retribution carried out against former Nazis in the days following the collapse of the Third Reich. There was a surge of long-suppressed hatreds against the German, especially when Soviet men and women remembered what cruelties they had exerted on Leningrad and other places. Soviet authorities often looked the other way when these women were targeted on the streets and stoned or beaten to death by angry mobs of Russian citizens. The feared Soviet prisoner of war regime. When the German invasion of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics began on 22 June 1941, the Soviet Union already had a working system for prisoners of war. This system of internment camps was known as Gulag, and its authorities had long-term experience of running camps and conducting interrogations. At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets had 8 prisoner of war camps, including normal camps for officers and other ranks, as well as punishment camps with more severe regimes. 30 reception camps were hurriedly created in Ukraine and Karelia to deal with the expected German prisoners of war, but after a month, only 19 were still in Soviet-held territory, due to the rapid advancement of the German army. In the early months of the war, the numbers of Germans taken prisoner by the Red Army were unsurprisingly not very large, as for the most part it was in retreat against the onslaught of Hitler's forces. Post-war German investigations into the numbers of soldiers captured by the Red Army suggested a figure of up to 30,000 by the end of 1941. The camp population included Romanians, Italians and Bulgarians, as well as Germans, and the lack of early medical assistance also played a role in the numbers dying, as did the hatred of the prisoners by both the Soviet soldiers and the local civilian population, which meant that there was no chance of any pity or additional food being forthcoming. This animosity was not confined to the Soviets, but also to the Romanians, who notoriously hated the German officers. Germans had forced thousands of Romanian conscripts to fight in Stalingrad and other important battles in the Eastern Front. When they were captured in 1942, the Soviets did not make differences between the Romanians and their German officers. However, the Romanians never forgot why they were there in the first place. When the convoy of prisoners of war were made to cross the Volga River in their way to an internment camp, the Romanians took the opportunity to drown the Germans in the river. It was a gruesome death for the dozens of German officers who had brutalized Romanian young men in battle. By the spring of 1943, Soviet authorities had begun detailed registration of its prisoners and commenced their transport to permanent camps, mainly in Uzbekistan, Astrakhan and Karaganda. Most of the transportation of prisoners was done through long and grueling train journeys. These journeys could last for several weeks at times, during which time prisoners had only intermittent access to food and water, aside from the boxcars being severely overcrowded. Of the first 30,000 prisoners sent in this way, only around 15,000 arrived alive. A speech given by Stalin shortly before had been published in Pravda and read by millions, where he asked for German enemies to be destroyed to the last man. Disobeying the supreme leader was an offense punishable by death, but they would also face court-martials if they violated the Geneva Convention. So Red Army and secret police staff just left the prisoners to their own fate, letting them die slow and painful deaths. 1944 was a year of amazing military success for the Red Army, and just that year 700,000 German and other Axis troops were captured, the majority in the second half of the year. Shortages of camp space, food, medical supplies, clothing and transport were all in evidence, a problem that was only made worse by the prisoners' belongings and clothing being looted after capture. Large numbers of Germans and others died in the early months of the year from cold and starvation, heart complaints and typhus. This remained the case in 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, and even more German and Axis military personnel came under Red Army control. The Soviets were in no rush to improve the holding and transportation conditions for these prisoners. It has been calculated that from the 1st of January to the 13th of May 1945, a total of 2.5 million prisoners were taken by the Red Army in all fronts. Only about 33% of those prisoners were alive just 3 years later. Spine-chilling revelations of a German prisoner of war in Latvia. Gottlob Biedermann was an officer in the 132nd Infantry Division of the German Army and was sent to the Eastern Front in 1941. He participated in battle in Crimea, Sebastopol, Leningrad, and the Courland Pocket. It was precisely during his appointment to the Courland Army when his entire division surrendered on the 8th of May 1945. Biedermann became known in recent years, after he published his memoirs in 2000, telling several raw stories about the Eastern Front and the treatment he and his comrades received on part of the Soviet army. His first encounter with his Russian captors was quite violent, as they started ripping decorations and insignia from the uniforms of the Germans. They made everyone stand in a line with their arms up and started to tear wristwatches and wedding rings from them. After that, the German prisoners were marched for 3 days before they received any food, so they had to resort to grass and tree bark to offset the hunger. When they finally were given some hot food, it was only thin cabbage broth. Finally placed in a holding camp at Sloka, Latvia, they were visited by delegations from an anti-fascist organization called the National Committee of German Officers, which was part of the National Committee for a Free Germany. This group was composed mostly of German defectors from the ranks of German prisoners of war and also of members of the Communist Party of Germany who moved to the Soviet Union after the Nazi seizure of power. They tried to persuade the captured Nazis of the benefits of communism and assured them that they would make sure to personally deliver whatever letters they wanted to write home. This proved to be a ruse for the Soviets to obtain information, as none of the letters ever reached their destination. Next, the guards at the camp made every prisoner strip down and checked for SS tattoos. Bearing one at that time was a death sentence. Although Biedermann did not personally witness any execution, he recalls that prisoners with tattoos were segregated and then vanished, with nobody ever seeing them again. It is thought that they were executed in cold blood somewhere in the camp. In mid-July, the camp was broken up and the men dispersed to various labor camps. Here Biedermann encountered Germans who had been captured during 1944 and was shocked by their general condition. He described them as living skeletons with close-cropped skulls and hollow cheeks. They had lifeless, glassy eyes staring straight ahead, and their skin was grey. Malnourished, they walked laboriously in wooden clogs, and their uniforms were little more than rags. They had been imprisoned for less than a year. To Biedermann thought of them as a cruel reminder that there was no hope for his future. On the 7th of November, his Soviet guards told Biedermann that the Wehrmacht had ceased to exist, that ranks had been abolished, and that he and his comrades now needed to work to repay the damage done to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics by the fascists. There is no certainty about the overall number of captives taken by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics during the conflict. Detailed analyses of both German and Soviet figures only indicate the discrepancies between the agencies. It is believed that the total number could reach upward of 1 million people. Most German prisoners in Soviet hands, including Biedermann, were repatriated in the course of 1948. During his captivity, he had been transferred between different camps, from Latvia to Siberia, and finally to a forced labor camp near Gagrilovo in the Caucasus. One day, he and 50 of his comrades were rounded up and placed in a boxcar. They had no idea of their destination, and at first they believed they were being transferred again, but noticed that they kept traveling west. This got their hopes up, and finally, after approximately a week, they reached the train's destination at Frankfurt by the Oder. There they were paraded and told to place all their possessions at their feet. German and Allied authorities carefully examined the belongings of each and every prisoner. Biderman passed the inspection, but a senior lieutenant who was standing next to him had a wooden box that was sealed. The inspecting officer broke it to find it contained an iron cross. He was then replaced inside the train and taken away, and he did not return to Germany until many years later. The horrible fates of Germans long after the war. Due to the extent of the destruction the Nazis left in the Soviet Union, the reconstruction work was expected to take a long time. Stalin had already stated several times that, as the war came to an end, prisoners of all the enemy states, irrespective of nationality, could expect long terms of forced labor. This increased deployment into the Soviet economy had been well signposted by Moscow's public statements in the previous 2 years. At Tehran in late 1943, Stalin had spoken of needing 4 million forced laborers for many years as reparations. By the summer of 1944, this had become 5 million for 10 years, a demand repeated at subsequent meetings of the Allied powers. A general order on the 16th of December 1944 decreed that all German men between the ages of 17 and 45, and all women between 18 and 45-30, in the liberated territories of southeastern Europe who were capable of work, were to be taken to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Within 2 months, around 110,000 had already been identified and transported, to be joined by another 100,000 from occupied Germany in the first months of 1945. This was also the fate of the German prisoners in Soviet hands, with only around 100,000 who were too ill, too old, or too young being exempted. The remainder were corralled in approximately 60 camps in Poland and eastern Germany prior to their transport into the Soviet Union, a process that was completed by the end of October 1945. Prisoner labor was also sent to specific locations in other sovereign territories where important raw materials were at stake, for example to Jachimov in Czechoslovakia, where they were tasked with mining the uranium necessary for Stalin's new nuclear industry. At first, Stalin claimed that they were planning on keeping prisoners for as long as it was needed for reconstruction, a task that he had calculated would take 15 years. In actuality, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics released most of its Axis prisoners between May 1945 and the end of 1949, which still was considerably longer than most of the Allied powers. Most of these released prisoners were old, ill, or unfit for work for one reason or another. On the 6th of June 1945, it was decreed that any future releases and repatriations would require Politburo approval and would be based on a series of stated criteria. By this stage, the secret police had already compiled a list of around 225,000 German and Austrian soldiers in camps and hospitals who were unfit for work, but this excluded officers who were required to remain in captivity. By August, a total of 708,055 prisoners had been identified as qualified for release, among them 412,000 Germans, again on the basis that they were unfit for work. But what happened to the rest? Although interested in getting rid of prisoners who were economically useless, the Soviet authorities were still keen to stop those with evident anti-Soviet views from leaving, and so anyone suspected was to be held back under a suitable pretext. As the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics wanted to maximize the labor potential of the prisoners, Sergei Kruglov, as head of the Ministry of Development, put forward a plan to send home 150,000 men unfit for labor and increase the rations of the remaining prisoners by 10% to improve productivity. German accounts of captivity reflected on the hunger culture in most of the 2,500 camps inside the Soviet Union, but also noted that this was shared by the neighboring civil populations. There simply was not enough food in the country, whose productive capacity was completely destroyed during the war. The same German accounts speak of widespread dysentery among the prisoners and also reflect on their behavior patterns, on the hoarding of food, on the taboos that remained about eating certain things even in the direst hunger, on the ways in which food was stolen and traded within the camp, and even the prisoners' slow movement in everything they did. Desperation was also evident in the attempts at self-mutilation once it was known that those unfit for work were being sent home. There were accounts of men amputating fingers or inducing blindness. Most subtle were attempts to ingest excessive quantities of salt that would induce edema, and it was reckoned that some men were repatriated as a result, but that others died in the attempt. After the incredible acts of Nazi cruelty and destruction perpetrated on Soviet soil, The time finally came for retaliation. Red Army soldiers and officers showed no mercy toward the Nazi invaders, killing them on the spot, torturing them in the field and in the labor camps, and making them work to exhaustion in reconstructing the Soviet economy after the war. Men and women from all the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics volunteered to fight the Nazis, and those who did not join the army joined popular militias in every town of the country. It could be said that the cruelty with which the Soviets treated the German captured men and women was only proportional to the cruelty they had received from them. But as we have seen, the Soviets took this revenge further, even extending the prisoners' suffering for several years after the war. It was not rare for German prisoners to wish they had been killed in action, instead of surviving the war to fall into Soviet hands. The Geneva Convention meant nothing to Stalin's men. As for them, German prisoners were little more than scum who deserved the worst treatment possible.